Hi, James. How are you?
Hey, hi, Mary Jo. How are you?
I'm good. Can you tell me how to correctly pronounce your last name?
Sure. If you think of the country Peru, add a K, so Paruk.
Paruk, James Paruk. Okay, good. I'm so thrilled you're here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm glad it worked out. And you mentioned, Mary Jo, I'll try to keep it to 20 minutes. And then that way there's Q&A if people want.
Yeah, we have the Q&A after both readers have gone, and they're just so great and really fun, and people have really great insight and questions. So
Okay.
that'll be really, I'm really excited about that part.
Okay, sounds good. All right.
Mary Jo, can you hear me? Am I on this right?
Yeah, hi Jeannine, how are you?
Hi. Good. I'm good.
You're kind of across the top, so I didn't see you. You were.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I can't, I'm seeing like the screen share, so I'm not seeing all the.
Jeannine, will you tell me how to pronounce your last name as well?
Ouellette.
Ouellette.
Mhm. How's this transition going from the Banville Loft to the North Suburban Center for the Arts and all that's happening that's new?
I won't speak to all of it, but for as a board member and doing the reading series, it's full speed ahead and really dynamic. And I just feel like Hanya and Abby are just doing a really great job steering the ship. I mean, it's cumbersome, obviously, but it feels like it's going great. There are a lot of moving parts, but I don't want to speak for Hanya or Abby. So.
Well, that's great. I'm happy to hear it's exciting. And is the center affiliated with the university in some way? Because the Zoom comes up as U of M.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that.
Oh, I was just wondering if the center is affiliated with the university in some way because of the Zoom comes up as U of M.
Oh, I'm gonna pop in here. It actually isn't.
Oh.
I'm Hanya. Abby, our director, she uses her U of M account
Oh, okay.
sometimes to make the Zooms, but we
Yeah.
just have our own Zoom account. So next
Okay.
time it's gonna be through that.
Oh yeah, I was just curious because I'm a university employee, and so I'm, you know, when that Zoom popped up, I was like, oh,
Mhm.
okay.
I understand where the confusion came from. I'm gonna wait a few more minutes before we begin, just to see if more people join.
Great, thank you.
I think we'll begin now. My name is Hanya. I'm the office administrator at North Suburban Center for the Arts, and this is Mary Jo, our curator. Before we begin, and I hand it over to Mary Jo, I'm just gonna go over some Zoom etiquette. So we ask that anyone but the speaker, so only the speaker, keep their mics on. Everyone else should have it muted because it's a one-channel audio. So even if you sneeze or do anything, everyone's gonna hear you, and it'll interrupt the reading. And other than that, it can get overwhelming to have a bunch of little screens up there. So you can pin the speaker to your screen so it feels more real, like you're actually there listening to a reader. And lastly, if you have any questions, you can just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them in the end, so you don't forget as you go. But yeah, now over to Mary Jo.
Thanks, Sonia. I was unmuting myself, which is always a process. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm so excited to be welcoming James Paruk and Janine Ollette this evening. And I hope that as they present their readings, that you will keep in mind some questions that you'd like to ask them. It's always so fun to have a robust conversation about their readings and their insights and their works. So that said, let's kick this off, and I will ask, excuse me, James to go first and give him a little intro here. James Paruk is a professor of biology at St. Joseph's College in Maine and has been studying common loons across North America for the past 28 years. He has published over 25 scientific articles on loons and recently wrote a book, Loon Lessons, Uncommon Encounters with the Great Northern Diver, and that's the University of Minnesota Press. And it takes an evolutionary approach to understanding their behavior and life history strategy. Jennifer Ackerman, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Genius of Birds, said Loon Lessons will delight and amaze you. James, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, great. It's wonderful to be here. Good evening, everybody. Glad you're here and aboard. I'm in Maine and it's 75 degrees, so kind of strange for all of us and like 70% humidity. So what I'm going to do is read a couple excerpts from the book for you. And I'm just going to kind of get started and dive right into it. So this one's from chapter 2, and I'm comparing cormorants and loons. And what I've tried to do in each chapter is just give you some personal narrative, some experiences I've had with these birds. And mind you, I'm from the Midwest, so the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin. I did some research in Minnesota. So I've seen loons on their breeding grounds and studied them for over 10, 15 years on the breeding grounds. In the last 10 years, I've been studying loons on the wintering grounds. And this particular story takes me to the Gulf of Mexico. So I lowered my, and by the way, I'm also near the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. So the water's a little bit turbid, and I'm studying loons in the wintertime in that environment. So I lowered my arm off the front end of the boat, opened my hand underwater, and with the measuring stick confirmed what I had suspected. It completely disappeared 18 inches below the surface. How could any visual predator find prey under these conditions? In my more than 30 years as a naturalist, I've had many amazing encounters with wildlife and observed a lot of fascinating behavior. But this story ranks up there as one of my most memorable. In January 2012, I was doing winter loon surveys off the Louisiana coast in the Gulf of Mexico. My mind was struggling to comprehend how loons can find food in this environment. They are visual predators, and the murky water have made it extraordinarily challenging to locate prey. We were in a series of channels dotted with islands when we spotted a bottlenose dolphin. Any dolphin sighting makes for a great day, but this one was acting peculiar. It was swimming towards shore and would then swim back to the middle of the channel and repeat the same maneuver. What was it doing, we were all saying to ourselves. We could see ripples of water near shore from fish racing away from the dolphin. It must be pushing the schooling fish to shallower water to increase its foraging odds. That's it, we shouted to each other. Then we saw a common loon following the wake of the dolphin as it moved toward shore. At first, we were skeptical, but the longer we observed, the more certain we were that the loon was consciously swimming back and forth each time in the wake to get any fish the dolphin missed. The behavior did not look cooperative by any means. It simply looked like the loon was aware of what the dolphin was trying to accomplish and knew its chances of catching fish increased when swimming in the wake. Now that was really amazing. So for me, just seeing loons in the Gulf of Mexico after seeing them in Minnesota and Maine, and then interacting with the marine cetacean, such as a dolphin, that was beyond my wildest imaginations, that such an interspecies interaction would occur, and that the loons were bright enough to recognize what the dolphins were trying to accomplish, and the schooling fish were jumping off to the sides, and that's exactly where the loons were feeding. So that's what my initial story, and I'll jump to another one for you. So this is more another narrative that I experienced, subtitled Intrusions and Contests. In 1994 at Manistee Lake in Michigan, I observed two loons vigorously fighting, locking bills, powerfully slapping their wings at each other. It was intense. Both birds dove underwater, still with locked bills, and after 30 to 40 seconds, they resurfaced. One bird was fleeing, the other pursuing, both flapping their wings and rowing across the lake. Eventually, the pursuer stopped chasing, and within 15 minutes, the loon that was being pursued flew off the lake. This was a glimpse of the dark side of the loon behavior that few people discuss, preferring to see loons as protectors of their young and devoted parents rather than as aggressive attackers. Yet they are aggressive in late spring and early summer and will attack not only other loons, but other water birds, such as ducks, grebes, mergansers, and cormorants. In 2011, a wonderful colleague, Mark Pokris, director of the School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University, showed me a loon's sternum with several holes in it. I was perplexed as to why a loon would have holes in its sternum. Mark had noticed them in both males and females. He was curious. So he placed the bill of a loon into one of the holes and it fit perfectly. Why would a loon attack another loon? The drive to reproduce dominates animals' behavior, and thus at some point in a young loon's life, its motivational urge to breed overrides its fear of an aggressive encounter with the resident loon, and it tests the waters, so to speak. Because a loon that is tentative may never gain access to a territory or obtain a mate and produce young, selection has nudged young adult loons, like bighorn sheep and bull elk, to overcome this tentativeness with aggression. Loons battle other loons for access to a territory, but rarely does a contest between animals end in the death of one of the participants. Loons are long-lived. We now know over 30 years. Why not live to see another day and wait its turn? Or another option is to explore and find an unoccupied lake, and with luck, a mate, and start reproducing there. Does the more experienced or the more youthful loon win the contest? Behavioral ecologists studying contests between rival males in the animal kingdom have typically found that the territorial owner wins the contest. Owners have more to lose and more motivation to defend their territory against intruders. Territorial owners often display more aggression, are the first to attack, and will fight longer than an intruder. Breeding territorial loons are hardwired to respond with aggression to an intruding loon. They are hardwired to attack most anything swimming in their territory, including mallards. One might describe a breeding loon as uber aggressive. Walter Piper estimated that 16 to 33% of all territorial evictions in male loons are fatal for the displaced owner. I am unclear why this percentage is so high. One explanation is that this high fatality rate occurs when a population age structure is skewed toward older individuals, because older individuals tend to invest more energy in reproduction and survival than younger individuals. Another hypothesis is that this high fatality rate occurs when the demand for breeding is intense. So just this last little thought here, researchers at Tufts University performed necropsies on 574 loons. They found 51% of the females and 44% of the males had sternal punctures, and the average number of sternal punctures for both sexes was 7. So that tells us that loons are aggressive towards other loons. We may not always see that. They will attack other loons, and that's one of the reasons loons spend so much time peering, looking under the water, because they have to look out for another loon that might be aggressive. And what was interesting is that female aggression seemed to be just as high as male aggression. Okay, so I have another little brief story for you. This one's a story, and it's interesting. I heard someone talk about roving parts, and this one has a few roving parts to it. This is about bird migration. So wildlife research involves roving parts, and sometimes things do not always go according to plan. Here's a good example. In 1998, Dave Evers and I were at Walker Lake, Nevada, teaming up with researchers Mike Yates and Mark Fuller from Boise State University, Larry Neal from the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and Kevin Kenow from the U.S. Geological Service in Wisconsin. Each team was there to do a specific job. Mike and Mark from Boise were the leaders of the project. The team from Nevada had the boats, the drivers, and the expertise to navigate around the lake. And the USGS staff and Kevin were responsible for conducting the surgeries and implanting satellite transmitters. Dave and I were there to catch loons. We all met the third week in April. Now, during the 1990s, Larry Neal noticed hundreds on some days and more than 1,000 loons on Walker Lake during fall and spring. It was suspected these loons bred in Canada. Walker Lake is a high elevation lake, 11 miles long and 5 miles wide, located 75 miles southeast of Reno. So I just go on and just explain a little bit more why Walker Lake supports so many loons, because there's lots of native fish about the right size that loons like. So after we went through introductions, The Boise State team notified us that the satellite transmitters were not in hand and would arrive the next day. So strong winds were forecasted each evening, and going out on the lake might be potentially too dangerous. The winds from this region are known to howl down the mountain and through the valley, creating large whitecaps and dangerous conditions. So we tossed around our limited options. Dave and I offered that we were not sure we could catch loons outside of the breeding season. Recall that on breeding lakes, adult loons with chicks remain on the surface and are fairly easy to catch. But without chicks, such as during migration, the parental instinct to protect their young it simply does not exist. Because we did not know if we were going to have success or how strong the winds would be each night, we decided to go out and at least try. So now we go out in the boat, there's several of us, and we're trying to find loons. And eventually the hard work pays off and we catch a bunch of loons. So now here's our situation. We caught 5 loons, but we were faced with the hard reality that the satellite transmitters would not arrive until the next day. And we had no place to keep the loons overnight. Did we release them and then try our luck tomorrow? But what if the weather conditions worsened as expected and we could not launch our boats? Loons are big, hardy birds, and with our collective experience, we felt the loons would be fine if we kept them overnight. But where? With limited options, we reasoned we had to take them with us to our hotel rooms. Was this going to work? Seriously? Did the hotel manager, did we tell them that each of us would have an additional guest? So we decided to keep the 3 largest individuals for surgeries. Kevin injected saline solution under the skin to keep them hydrated. We put them in cardboard boxes with holes, placed the life jacket in the bottom of the box to protect the birds' keels. And we placed 1 loon per room, and we turned on the air conditioners to keep them cool. The loons were calm, but we discussed that the loons might be better off if their weight was supported by water. I forgot whose idea it was to fill up the bathtub. You didn't hear this, by the way, but we did. And Dave lowered one of the loons into the bathtub. The bird did not panic, thank goodness, and simply floated there. So we posted 1 person in each bathroom, in each room, to make sure the loons were safe. Most of us were sleep deprived. Morning could not come fast enough, but our wait was extended because the satellite transmitters did not arrive until 12:30 p.m. We drove the loons to the local volunteer fire station. Kevin had sanitized the building and prepared it for the operations. I appreciated his calm demeanor and professionalism and was more than glad to give the loons to him. After they were sedated, Kevin made a small incision along the back between the scapulars and placed the transmitter beneath it. He then sewed up the incision with a couple of stitches. I must confess, I found it odd to see a loon under anesthesia, its body limp and stretched out over a table, with an oxygen regulator nearby and everyone wearing face masks. The surgeries went well, and we later released the loons at the lake. We watched them over the next 2 days, and within a couple of weeks, they flew off the lake. Mike Yates tracked them as they migrated and gave us updates. The loons flew to Saskatchewan. It's true, things do not always go according to plan, and especially in wildlife research. None of us liked the idea of holding those loons for more than 10 hours, but given the information we had, we decided it was best to hang on to them for the night rather than release them. That decision turned out to be the best one because the other nights during our stay were so windy, we never did get back on the water. So I've got like 2 minutes and I'm just going to tell you just a brief story and then I'll turn it over. So 12 years later, we're catching loons off the coast of Louisiana, and we implant satellite transmitters and track these individuals. And amazingly, one of those individuals went to Northwest Saskatchewan, where the loons at Walker Lake, Nevada had migrated to. And when you run the coordinates and you overlaid them, they actually stayed at the same lake. So if you talk about Princess Bride, I don't know if anyone knows that kind of silly movie, and you say the word inconceivable, I do not think you know what this means, but the fact that a loon that we catch in Nevada goes to this lake in northwest Saskatchewan, and a loon we catch off the Louisiana coast, like random birds, there's thousands of birds we caught, could have caught, actually went to that same lake, is just inconceivable. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, James. That was great. And thanks for sticking around, because I know I have a ton of questions myself, and I'm sure everyone else does too. So thanks, hang on. And I am thrilled to introduce Janine. Excuse me. Our next reader is Janine Ollette, and she's the author of The Part That Burns, a memoir in fragments acclaimed by Dorothy Allison as a book she loves, and by Joyce Carol Oates as a precisely imagined, poetically structured, compelling, and vivid. Janine's work has appeared in Calyx, Narrative, North American Review, Masters Review, Tupelo Quarterly, Writer's Chronicle, among others, and in several anthologies, including Misaligned, Women Writing About Men, and Women's Lives, Multicultural Perspectives. Her work has been supported by Malay Colony for the Arts and Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts. Janine teaches writing through the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop, and Elephant Rock, an independent creative writing program she founded in 2012. And she's working on her first novel. And Janine, thank you for being here. How are you?
Hi, Mary Jo. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming out to hear writers read. It's wonderful to be here with you. And tonight I'll be reading one chapter from The Part That Burns, which is probably the most fragmented and experimental chapter in the book. You know, much of the book is more traditional prose, as memoir typically is, but this chapter is kind of written as a prose poem. And it's called Wingless Bodies. So I'm going to begin with that, and then we'll probably have time to read just a little bit from some new and unpublished work that's in conversation. So, Wingless Bodies. 1. Oh, I should say this is in 5 parts, so you'll hear me name the parts. 1. Void. My father is not a swan. His bones are not hollow inside his flesh. The spaces between the phalanges of his feet are not spanned by delicate black webbing. My father has never once trumpeted. My father has no air sacs on his lungs. The doctors would have seen these when they cut through his not hollow breastbone to expose and unblock his heart. The idea is use an open artery to make a new pathway. The conclusion is close the original wound. My father's chest was pried open in Florida. Who knows how many curves of the river from Minnesota where I stood with the phone in my hand as he lay on the table. Minnesota, where my father was born and my mother was born and I was born, with weak lungs and a spine that grew crooked toward the window. Florida is far from the saltless amniotic waves of Lake Superior, far from the sulfur and stench and seduction of this river that flows through our bodies toward the sea, toward the Gulf of Mexico, where my father lives, recklessly, without air sacs. Air sacs and hollow bones are like life preservers. They keep swans afloat. I have never seen my father float. Partly this is because he does not care for water. Partly it is because I have so rarely seen my father, who, unlike a swan, did not mate for life. 2. Source. The Mississippi gurgles up from a clumsy knob and kettle landscape. Knobs are hills filled with coarse gravel and boulders dropped like loose change by the glacier's edge. Kettles are scars filled in by meltwater to make lakes and ponds and bogs. At the headwaters, I was 17 when Cyrus fucked me in a damp tent. I watched from above, recalling my stepfather's coarse hands. I bled, but it didn't hurt. It hurt, but it wasn't Cyrus's fault. It was his fault, but he was scarred, and I was scarred, and meltwater runs downhill. We could have had the baby, but we didn't. Cyrus stole stuff and sold it. Cars, drugs, guns, and something else, like that small thing inside him that was naked and open-beaked. Cyrus went to prison. The headwaters are best crossed holding a child's hand. Sometimes this threshold is no more than a rivulet you can skip over. The dust on your feet stays dry. Other times, the only way is to crawl in and lie down. Let the water rush over your supine body. Let the river run into your open mouth. Maybe you pull yourself out. I got married. I had babies. I brought them wild and uncombed to the source, where they scratched notes in careful cursive. This is the message. We are at the top of the river. Who are you? Please put us back in the water. We are floating to the sea. Carefully, they burnt the edges of these scrolls, match after match. Then they launched them in glass bottles toward the Gulf, where the fresh water spills into the brine. 3, dive. This river shapes my words, wears them down, spits them up onto the bank in piles of gravel and heaps of heavy round stones. Sometimes it hurts. I never learned how to sing alone without looking over my shoulder, not even in the shower. If you sing with me, though, I will find you. I will layer my voice on top of yours, inside of yours, like wax pooling in a candle, contained and alive in that column of light. When babies cry, we sing. Our voices pull anguish into melody, float fear and sadness between layers of sound. When the page before us is empty and untamed, we take it into our mouths. We chew it, fibrous and thick, until we can finally swallow it down. My mom was 18 and smoking True Blues when the house exploded. She was with my dad at a party, their newborn across town, maybe asleep. Gas line busted under the floorboards. 3 girlfriends on the couch, 2 dead. My mom tossed from where she sat between them. 12 feet into the yard, shoulder ripped from socket, ear dangling from scalp. We thought she had died, my aunt says. Too many people jumping up and down, my mom says. Someone flicked a cigarette, my dad says. Enormous hollow boom of blinding light. I was 22 when my first baby arrived, silent and awake. It was a cold August and she was a perfect slippery thing, puckered and featherless, yet bigger than me, bigger than all of us, limitless. Somehow the walls did not buckle and fall. The floor and ceiling did not blow out, though she expanded everywhere, like sea, like sky. I will never forget how it felt to hold her, salty and oceanic, my firstborn daughter, who breathed underwater and who would teach me finally how to dive. 4, fire. As embryos, regeneration is our default state. We lose our knack for it, though, except for stray parts, arteries, skin, lungs, isolated regions of the brain. Only the liver and severed bits of fingertips can grow all the way back. Even this could be a love story. Burns are slow to heal and can occur with or without flame. Help, I said to my husband 10 years into the blackening woods. I can't breathe. A wildfire is a large, destructive blaze that spreads quickly over woodland or brush, as with divorce. Not everyone needs to breathe, my husband said. Carefully, I struck a match. Adulteress, my husband said. He summoned the god of wind. Our children froze, the light reflected in their eyes. Hide, I said. Watch it burn, he said. In the event that your hair or clothes catch fire, you must drop to the ground, cover your face, and roll to smother the flames. It hurts, I said. Smoldering is a slow, low-temperature form of combustion, as with an aftermath. Still, I love the smell of wood smoke and tobacco. I dream of the cigarettes I smoked in high school, butts tossed into the parking lot, into the river, out of the window of Eva's Ford Pinto, careening down Snelling Avenue, crazy with sun and Madonna's promise of a first touch. Later, hunched over a smoldering coffee can in the basement during the winter of the divorce. 1 trillion cigarette butts end up as litter every year. How many were mine? How many still are? My son is a certified wildfire fighter. Most wildfires are arson, he tells me on a scorching July night, sharp hook of moon dangling above. Sometimes it's firefighters who do it, he says, so they can earn money when the fire season is slow. Fire starting is a felony, but workers need work. The air is hot and wet, alive with the smell of the river and the rising smoke of my son's Marlboro. 5. Horizon. The Arabic language has a word for love, ya abrani. It means, you bury me. This is Brighton Beach on Lake Superior. Today is his first time here. The man I was never supposed to love, but will someday marry on this exact stretch of shattered volcanic rock, our kids lined up in a half circle. The air will be bright and filled with bees. Now, though, our rain sheets sideways like needles. Marathoners limp onto the beach, radiant and broken. At the water's edge, we stand and stare into the mist. Mist forms when warm air meets low temperatures, as with breath exhaled into the cold. I see the horizon, he says. I don't, I say. I see us, he says. I see our kids, yours and mine. I see everything. Mist creates a visible beam of light, refracting and reflecting from suspended droplets. When you see me, I exist. When you see all of me exists. I'm not your father, he says years later on a bad day. But you are, I say. My father, my stepfather, my son. You are every man I have ever known. There is no other way. Okay, he says. I have no taste for piles of small talk. The body knows what it knows and skin remembers. I believe this man when he says he will outlive me so I can die in his arms. This is a message. Fire is not the only lick that scars. I want to burrow under the skin of this world and feel its bready heat. I am at the top of the river. I want to press my crooked backbone against the rocks. Who are you? I want his wingless body, his solid bones. The rest is feathers and ash. Please put me back in the water. I want the imperfect circle of our open mouths melting like wax through the only artery. We are, all of us, floating to the sea.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Excuse me. Again, I hope everyone will send a question via chat or raise your hand virtually, or just throw in for either Janine or James. And I'm really so interested every time I do these monthly readings that there always seems to be some sort of connection between the authors that is unintended, these amazing accidents. And I was just struck by the poetry of both Janine and James, these naturalistic images that you both right about. Did you get together and plan this, you guys? Did you have a secret coffee meeting where you? It was just really striking to me. Was it to anyone else?
Well, I can comment that I thought it was really fascinating. Jean's really helped me visualize things that I could relate to in the natural world into a larger context. So I really appreciated that.
Well, thanks. I was really excited to read with you, Jim, because I have a class right now I'm teaching on writing animals through the prison writing workshop. It was a request of the women, my students at Shakopee Prison. And so, that's been really fascinating to learn about that. But I did choose this excerpt specifically because I felt like it was in some conversation,
Yeah.
So
That's a really great way to put it, in conversation. Jeannine, can you tell us more about the Minnesota prison writing workshop and how you came to be a part of that? And is it reflecting in your work these days? Or I would just love to know more about that.
Yeah, I guess I learned about the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop is about to celebrate its 10th year. So there's a public reading on October 16th, actually, that anyone can look this up, and it will be virtual on Zoom. Typically, in non-pandemic times, it's been held at Hamlin. But the workshop started 10 years ago by a woman named Jen Bowen, who's actually an alum of the same grad school that I went to, which is Vermont College of Fine Arts. And another very well-known alum of that school is Wally Lamb. And some may know that Wally Lamb started a prison writing workshop, in his area on the East Coast. And so Jen heard him talking about that and was inspired by it and came back, to Minnesota after her studies and really wanted to get a program like that going here. And so she did. And I learned about it. I think I've been involved for about 5 or 6 years now. I started and then just through the mentor program where I was working one-on-one with students who were incarcerated, and it's like a correspondence program. And then for the last few years, I've been teaching classes. So, both in person, but then during the pandemic, virtual and by correspondence. So a variety of creative ways that we're using to keep the programming going during especially hard times. These are really excruciatingly difficult times in our prison systems.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying more about that. Does anyone have a question or comment for James or Jeannine? Just checking the screens here. Please feel free to throw in. Anyone? Okay. Just feel free to throw in if I'm talking too much. James, one of the things that I really loved about your book is that you really make this, you really provide this on-ramp to technical and scientific information because of your own passion. And as you were reading your excerpts, I was wondering what your first glimpse into the naturalist James was in your youth, like how that started for you, and why Loons? Like what was that journey about?
No, that's a great question, and something that wasn't brought up in the book. But I was born and raised in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is an enclave of Detroit. So it's Wayne County. And when I was there were 20,000 people per square mile. So it's one of those very traditional urban areas where you can stick your hand out and meet the house next door. And there was no grass for playgrounds, right? It was all concrete. So my entire childhood through 18 years was a concrete jungle. I just played sports, and our family, which was a very tight family, a very loving family, but we never went hiking, camping, fishing. That was outdoor recreation is not what my parents pursued and interested. So one thing I'll share briefly with you is I went to our librarian director, and my interactions with her was just to try to direct my reading. And I had a wonderful relationship with our librarian director, getting me to read Jack London in the very beginning, to get me interested in the natural world. And she directed my book reading for like the next 5-6 years. And so just a wonderful relationship with her, guiding me mostly through fiction. So even though I'm a scientist, I spent probably a good part of 10 years reading lots of fiction. And so when Jeannine was writing, I just absolutely loved fiction. And part of that came up. So for me, my kind of discovery of the natural world was why I went to college, and very randomly went to a small school in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan that was more of a natural resources, wildlife type of school, where you meet students who have similar interests, and actually was going out with one of those students into the woods for the first time. And I saw a very small bird called a brown creeper. Now, most people might remember a chickadee. Well, brown creeper is small like a chickadee, and this bird was spiraling around the trunk of a tree, literally right in front of me. And I could remember it to this day. And I had no clue what this bird was, and was just mesmerized by this bird working its way around the bark of the tree. And then it flew up, went to another tree and spiraled again. And that probably was a very pivotal moment in my exploration of the natural world, the realization that there's a lot out there that I just haven't been exposed to. And I feel my passion for natural history comes from kind of not being exposed to that for all those years, and that all these new discoveries continue to build. And that's why I feel I've ended up becoming such kind of a passionate naturalist. And Loons was just serendipity. College students, you meet some friends, and one of those friends for a master's degree was charged with trying to catch a common loon. And he was a good buddy of mine. So I'm like, sure, I'll help you try to catch a common loon. So we were probably 27, 28 years old, trying to figure out how to catch a loon. And because of that connection, I got exposed to loons. And that's kind of what really started my fascination with loons.
Wow, okay, thank you for that. We had someone ask the title of your book, and I just want to reiterate, it's Loon Lessons, Uncommon Encounters with the Great Northern Diver, and it's a delight. And of course, in Minnesota, you know that the loon is, I don't want to say mythological, but it is quite elevated in Minnesota culture. Jeannine, can you tell us more about the novel that you're working on and what your process has been like, going from memoir style to the novel process?
I can't really talk much about the novel in progress because I'm not really ready to yet. But I have written fiction in the past, and I studied fiction in grad school, and so it's really a delight, to be working on some fiction right now. And I feel like, but I also feel like what's interesting to me about the intersection of memoir and fiction in general, but novels in particular, is that a memoir bears so much more in common with a novel than, say, with what we would think of as traditional nonfiction. Some people think that there should be almost like a different name for the genre, like to lump all nonfiction together doesn't really make sense because it's so different. And I think Jim kind of pointed toward that when he actually mentioned fiction, and then in the same breath, talked about listening to my work, reminded him of his love of fiction. And I think that the reason, that underpins that is just simply that what we think of as elements of fiction are the very same building blocks that make memoir work, because it's really about telling a story, that that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that takes you through a dramatic question, that usually involves a significant conflict. And then, we want to be invested in whatever that point of view character. And in a memoir, typically, it's the memoirist. So it's that narrator, that first person narrator, but we want to care, like about what's happening to this person, and will they overcome whatever this challenge is, or what is it that they want, and will they get it, and if they do get it, is that a good thing or a bad thing, and if they don't get it, will it be a good thing or a bad thing? So the elements of that make those stories work are actually almost identical. The only difference is that in a memoir we are in fact obligated to tell the truest version, that we can of things that actually occurred. But to do it like with all of the fundamentals that make fiction work. The really fun thing about currently working on fiction is just that I get to really lean into the imaginative part of it, because what I'm writing about didn't actually happen. So like, I don't have any of the constraints that I faced in working on the memoir, which deals with some, difficult subject matter, as you would have heard in the reading. And so, all of the considerations of making sure that every character is treated with fairness, and integrity, and if people did bad things, that they're not presented, only as the sum of the worst things that they ever did, but instead as like full, complicated human beings, like we all wish to be seen as. And that actually, I feel like that can be harder when you're talking about real people. Like you have to really hold yourself to, I believe, a very high standard in that regard. Whereas in writing fiction, you still want everyone to feel real and complicated and complete. But the ethics aren't quite, could potentially troublesome. And so there's a freedom there.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Anyone online, anyone joining us via Zoom or just audio questions? Anyone? Oh, hold on, there's something in the chat. Vonda says that images that connect will be found in memoir, novel, nature, science, and writings, which is absolutely true. Anyone else? James and Jeannine, do you, I always like to ask this, do either of you have a question for the other? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Mm-hmm. I guess one thing I can ask Jeannine is kind of, when did you feel that you have any experience like I might have had with kind of discovery of nature that you may have had writing that inspired you to kind of pursue that?
I think I understand your question. I think we're talking about like inspiration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it really is interesting to read with you as a naturalist and a, nature writer and a science writer, because one of the things that I stress when teaching writing is that we find, I really, really believe this, and I actually just came into this reading, this Zoom, like straight out of the class that I teach, the animal writing class that I talked about. And so we were just talking about this, but metaphor exists already. Stories already exist in the world. And so often when we're telling a story, my genuine belief is that we can explore the inner life most truthfully and accurately by looking very, very closely at the outer world that we all share. And so when we look closely enough at the outer world, we are going to eventually see how it reflects, inner truths. And often it can do that in a more powerful and profound and gripping way than us just sort of recounting or trying to explain those inner truths. And so we just looked at a poem in the class that I just came out of into this reading called A Blessing by James Wright. And some of you, I don't know if anyone here knows the poem, maybe we could link it in the chat, but the poem describes an encounter that James Wright has with two ponies on the side of the road driving to Rochester, Minnesota. And so he and his friend, who ends up, it turns out it's Robert Bly, but he doesn't say that in the poem, but he gets out of the car and has this like experience of like, you know, this really intense experience of connection and communing with these wild ponies. And it's so beautiful, but the poem isn't really about ponies or that moment specifically. It's really about like the profound connection and loneliness of being alive. But he captures it by very, 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 very vividly observing and describing that moment. And so for me, yes, that kind of writing that examines something that we can all like, you know, see, feel, touch, sense, but that conveys something much deeper than the sum of its parts about what it means to like be alive in a human body, you know, bumbling along on this planet in this time and place. That's really special and miraculous to me. And that's what inspires me. But it keeps me attentive to the outside world is what I'm saying. It keeps me motivated to try to see more clearly and more deeply what's around me. Yeah. And, you know, I think you did talk a little bit about, you know, it's funny, like, it's almost like what's inspired by what you didn't have, like didn't grow up like in nature, have a lot of exposure to nature. But then when you did arrive at adulthood, you took that opposite direction and wanted to really, you know, dive into that direction. But what then inspired you to want to write about it? Because those really are two different things.
Yeah, I think for me, the more I learned about loons, I would give talks and there would always be a Q&A after the end of the talk. And people, always had a barrage of questions. And I found myself a bit repetitive in how I would approach and answer that question. So as a biologist, I might see through the world through a filter, or at least try and interpret what an animal is doing. So I might have like the filter of a biologist. And that's kind of how I felt that if I could write to someone who is in the audience, who's just trying to learn about loons, someone who's on the lake, that kind of my education and my training might help them see a loon differently, for example. And I think it was kind of it's interesting too, because it was a little frightening to kind of dive into that world, which I have very little experience. My writing is technical writing. And so this was very different and challenging in its own way, but something that was real exciting. And so as I kind of worked and developed the project, I found great satisfaction in trying to communicate ideas and concepts with it. So.
Thank you both so much. Anyone else with any questions or comments for James or Jeannine? Okay, hold on. Okay. Vonda points out, great pun, Jim, dive into that world. So thank you for that, Vonda. I want to thank you both again, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And again, thanks, and just really loved the readings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Bye, everyone. See you next month. Bye.
Bye-bye.